The sound made Harlan Crow stop mid-step. It wasn't crying. It wasn't coughing, whining, or the sharp panic screams that had haunted this hallway for weeks. It was nothing. Harlan stood frozen on the staircase, one hand gripping the polished iron railing as his eyes locked on the faint glow leaking from the twins' nursery. The house felt different. Too still. Too calm. Silence had never been this heavy before. He moved closer. The door was slightly open. Inside, Silas and Noelle lay in their beds, blankets pulled to their chests, faces soft in a way he hadn't seen since before everything fell apart. Their breathing was slow and even. Real sleep. The kind doctors promised but never delivered. Between the beds sat the new nanny, Zora Ellington. She was cross-legged on the rug, her back straight, palms open on her knees. She wasn't rocking, pacing, or singing. She wasn't doing anything that looked like effort. Her lips moved faintly, whispering words too quiet to hear, as though she was speaking to something unseen. A single lamp glowed behind her, casting warm shadows across the walls. For a moment, the room looked almost holy. Harlan's chest tightened. Nothing had worked. Not the sleep specialists flown in from Boston. Not the clinic in Palo Alto. Not the private therapist in Santa Monica who charged obscene amounts and promised miracles. The twins hadn't slept more than 20 minutes at a time since their mother died. Yet here they were. Sleep. Harlan felt awe first, then fear. Because peace had no business coming this easily. The Crow estate hadn't truly slept in weeks. Nights stretched endlessly, filled with pacing footsteps, whispered negotiations, and the quiet humiliation of helplessness. Harlan learned the patterns of exhaustion the way other men learn stock charts. 10 minutes of silence meant disaster was coming. 20 meant someone was about to scream. The twins always woke at the same time. 2:17 a.m. Noelle would sit straight up, eyes wide, fingers pressed to her ears. Silas followed seconds later, shaking, asking questions no one could answer. What was that sound? Why did the house feel empty? Why did it feel like someone was missing? Doctors blamed trauma. Therapists blamed attachment. One specialist suggested medication. Harlan refused. He'd already lost enough control. So he hired help. Nannies came and went. Some quit quietly. Some cried. One lasted less than a night. They tried routines, music, breathing exercises. Nothing held. The crying always came back, louder than before. Harlan stopped sleeping altogether. He sat in his office at night, watching security feeds, listening to the echoes of a house that felt too large for 3 broken people. He had silenced everything that reminded him of his wife. Her voice, her prayers, her gentle rituals. He told himself it was survival. But survival didn't look like this. And now, standing outside the nursery watching his children finally rest, Harlan felt something unfamiliar stir inside him. Hope, or fear of losing it. If you've ever lain awake at night wishing you could fix what's hurting the people you love, you already understand this moment. Tell me in the comments, what would you be afraid to hear in the silence? Zora Ellington arrived without spectacle, which was exactly why Harlan almost sent her away. He'd grown used to resumes padded with promises and voices too loud for a grieving house. Zora spoke softly, asked fewer questions than expected, and listened as if listening were the job itself. She wore no perfume, no sharp confidence, no practiced smile. Her references were brief, her hands steady, her eyes calm. Harlan hired her because exhaustion makes decisions for men who refuse to rest. On her first night, Zora noticed what everyone else missed. The twins didn't fear darkness. They feared the moment after the house went quiet. So she stayed with them through the silence. She asked them about their dreams, about the sound they heard, about the woman they missed. When their voices shook, she didn't interrupt. When tears came, she didn't rush them. And when the clock crept toward 2:17, Zora whispered words that felt older than the room. Not instructions. Not techniques. Something remembered. She spoke of a God who listens in the dark and never leaves before morning. By the time the house exhaled, the twins had followed. Sleep came quietly like permission. Zora stayed where she was, guarding nothing, trusting everything. And down the hall, unseen, Harlan watched his world pause. He didn't know whether to step forward or step back. Either choice felt dangerous. The quiet dared him to breathe. And for once he did. That frightened him more than noise ever had. Inside his own home, morning light crept through the nursery curtains and the silence still held. Harlan hadn't slept. He stood in the doorway watching the twins breathe, afraid the spell would break if he spoke. They didn't stir. Zora rose quietly as if she'd been there all night. She turned and found Harlan's eyes already on her. Suspicion returned before gratitude could form. "What did you give them?" Harlan asked. His voice sounded harsher than he meant. Zora met his gaze without flinching. "Nothing," she said. "I listened." Harlan pressed, listing pills, oils, tricks, experts. Zora shook her head. "They wake every night at the same minute," she said. "They hear the house go empty. Silence scares them." Then she added the words that stopped his breath. "They hear their mother." "Not a ghost," Zora said gently. "A memory that hasn't finished loving them yet." Harlan staggered back, the past rushing in. His wife's prayers. The way he'd ordered them erased. Zora hadn't known. Yet she'd done it anyway. With God. And with the children. Harlan felt something crack. Faith, long locked away, knocked softly to be let in. He looked at Zora, then at the twins, and understood the house had been waiting. For a voice brave enough to speak in the dark. Zora's eyes filled, not with relief, but recognition. She knew that prayer. She had learned it here. Years ago from the woman Harlan still loved. The morning held its breath. So did he. Answers were coming and none would be easy. The quiet promised consequences. He stood ready. Finally. Harlan Crow built his life on certainty. Markets rose and fell, companies failed or flourished, but control was always possible if you moved fast enough and paid enough attention. Grief shattered that belief. After his wife died, uncertainty crept into every corner of the house, so he tried to seal it out. He replaced warmth with order, rituals with rules, love with systems that never asked questions. He installed cameras in hallways, sensors on doors, monitors in the nursery. He tracked sleep cycles, heart rates, breathing patterns. He demanded reports. Silence to him meant safety. If nothing moved, nothing could break. But silence had betrayed him. Standing in the nursery, Harlan realized control had not protected his children. It had isolated them. The twins didn't need correction. They needed comfort. Something he had locked away along with every reminder of their mother. Zora hadn't tried to fix the twins. She had joined them where they were. That terrified him. Because it meant the problem was never unsolvable. It was unattended. "You crossed a line," Harlan said quietly, unsure whether he was warning her or himself. Zora nodded. "I know." Yet she didn't apologize. That unsettled him more than defiance ever could. For the first time since his wife's death, Harlan felt the walls he built begin to weaken. Control had kept him standing, but it had also kept him alone. And now, with his children sleeping peacefully behind him, he had to face the truth he'd avoided. Letting go was the risk, and he had never been good at risk. He left the room without another word, retreating to the hallway that once echoed with prayers he pretended not to miss. Downstairs, the cameras blinked quietly, still watching. Harlan wondered how many moments of grace he had already recorded and ignored. The thought followed him like a shadow. Control no longer felt powerful. It felt afraid. Zora remained in the nursery long after Harlan left. She didn't move until she was certain the twins were deep enough in sleep to stay there. Only then did she stand, smoothing the rug with care, as if the room itself deserved gentleness. She had learned long ago that pain retreats when it is respected, not rushed. This house carried grief in its walls. She felt it the first day she walked in. Grief that hadn't been named. Grief that had been disciplined into silence. Zora understood that kind of quiet. She'd grown up around it. In homes where prayers were whispered because shouting hurt too much. She hadn't planned to say God's name that night. It had simply come out when the twins asked why the dark felt lonely. Zora told them what she believed. That God listens even when people stop talking. That love doesn't disappear just because someone does. She spoke carefully, knowing faith could heal or wound depending on how it was held. When she finally stepped into the hallway, she noticed the cameras. She always noticed them. Zora had nothing to hide, but she understood what watching meant. Fear disguised as protection. She wondered how long Harlan had been watching instead of joining. As she walked downstairs, she paused at a framed photo tucked near the staircase. A woman smiled back at her. The recognition hit hard. Zora touched the frame lightly, her throat tightening. She whispered a prayer she hadn't spoken in years. Not for herself. For the man who still thought silence was strength. And for the children learning to sleep again. The house felt warmer. Morning waited patiently. That night, Harlan didn't go to his office. He lingered in the hallway outside the nursery, telling himself it was coincidence, telling himself he just happened to pass by. The house dimmed into its familiar quiet, and his chest tightened as the minute hand crept forward. 2:16. Inside the room, Zora sat where she had the night before. She didn't look toward the door. She didn't acknowledge him. She trusted the moment to unfold without permission. The twins lay awake, eyes open, hands curled near their faces. When the clock clicked over, the house went still. Noel's breathing hitched. Silas whispered her name. Zora leaned forward slightly and spoke, barely louder than breath. God, she said, not as a performance, not as a command. As if God were already there and listening. You promised never to sleep. So stay with us now. Harlan felt the words before he understood them. Zora didn't ask for miracles. She didn't beg. She thanked God for watching over children who felt forgotten by the dark. She spoke of love that outlives loss. Of rest that comes when fear finally lays itself down. The twins relaxed slowly, like knots loosening one at a time. Their breathing deepened. Their hands softened. Harlan pressed his palm to the wall. Those weren't Zora's words. They were familiar. Painfully familiar. His wife used to pray that way. Every night. Same rhythm. Same gentleness. Same faith that never demanded proof. Harlan stepped back before Zora could see him. The realization hit like grief reborn. He had buried that prayer along with her memory. Yet somehow it had survived. Spoken again. Alive in his house. He wasn't ready to face it. But he couldn't escape it either. The prayer followed him into the dark. Waiting. Harlan avoided the nursery the next morning. He stayed in his study, staring at a framed photograph he hadn't moved in years. His wife smiled up at him, caught mid-laugh, sunlight in her hair. Saying her name out loud felt dangerous, like reopening something that had never fully closed. He'd convinced himself silence was respect. That erasing reminders would dull the ache. It hadn't. The twins' laughter drifted faintly from down the hall. Soft. Unforced. That sound unsettled him more than their screams ever had. Joy required presence. It demanded participation. And Harlan had mastered absence. He remembered the night he ordered the prayers to stop. How the house had gone cold afterward. How he told himself God understood grief better than ritual. How he never asked whether his children needed those words more than he did. Zora knocked once before entering. She didn't mention the prayer. She didn't accuse. She simply said the twins asked for pancakes and wondered if their mother liked blueberries. Harlan swallowed hard. He nodded. When Zora left, he finally whispered his wife's name. Sounded strange. Fragile. Real. The house didn't collapse. The memory didn't destroy him. Instead, it lingered, quiet but alive. Harlan realized grief wasn't the enemy. Silence was. And he had fed it for too long. Down the hall, Zora hummed softly while cooking. The twins waited patiently, unafraid. Harlan stayed where he was, learning something unfamiliar. Letting memory breathe didn't kill him. It brought him closer to living. Harlan finally confronted her after dinner. The twins were in the living room, building something lopsided out of wooden blocks, their voices low and steady. Another small miracle he didn't yet trust. Harlan asked Zora to step into the kitchen. The distance felt deliberate, as if walls could keep truth contained. You don't get to decide what my children believe, he said. Zora listened without interrupting. She always did. I hired you to help them sleep, Harlan continued, his voice tight. Not to bring God into this house. Not to reopen things I closed for a reason. Zora nodded once. I understand. That answer frustrated him more than resistance would have. Do you? He asked. Because if you cross that line again, you're gone. No references. No second chances. For the first time, Zora's calm wavered. Not fear. Resolve. I didn't bring God, she said quietly. They were already asking for him. Harlan turned away, jaw clenched. He hated how reasonable she sounded. How little power his ultimatum carried when his children were finally at peace. Zora spoke again carefully. I won't force faith on them. But I won't lie either. When children are scared, they reach for what feels familiar. For them, that's love. And love had a language here before me. The words landed heavier than accusation. Harlan dismissed her with a sharp nod. As Zora returned to the twins, he stayed behind, shaken by a truth he didn't want to admit. He wasn't afraid of religion. He was afraid of remembering who he'd been before grief taught him to hide. That night, Zora couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, listening to the house settle, memories pressing close. She hadn't planned to stay long when she took the job. Just enough to help. Just enough to move on. But some places pull at old threads whether you want them to or not. She remembered being younger, standing in a much smaller kitchen, watching a woman pray while stirring a pot on the stove. The woman believed God belonged in ordinary moments. Not shouted. Not displayed. Just spoken gently, like reassurance whispered into daily life. That woman had changed Zora's understanding of faith. After she died, Zora carried those prayers with her. Not because she was strong, but because letting them go felt like another loss she couldn't afford. Working in the Crow house reopened something she thought was healed. The smell of the halls. The way the stairs creaked. The soft echo of a voice she once admired. Zora hadn't expected recognition to come so fast or so painfully. She knew Harlan didn't remember her. She had been younger then. Quieter. Invisible by design. Someone who helped and then disappeared. That was how it was meant to be. But when the twins asked about the dark, the answer rose uninvited. Zora realized truth doesn't always wait for permission. Sometimes it insists. She lay back and closed her eyes, whispering a prayer she'd learned long ago. Not for safety. For courage. Because tomorrow the truth would come closer to the surface. And when it did, someone would finally have to decide whether love was worth reopening old wounds. The house listened. Waiting. Harlan began noticing things he had ignored before. The way Zora moved through the house without hesitation. How she knew which floorboard creaked near the stairs and which cabinet stuck unless lifted slightly. Small knowledge, easily dismissed, yet too precise to be coincidence. He told himself it meant nothing. Grief had made him suspicious of patterns. But then he saw her pause at the piano in the sitting room. No one touched that piano anymore. It had belonged to his wife. Harlan watched from the doorway as Zora brushed her fingers across the closed lid, not playing, not opening it, just acknowledging its presence. The moment passed quickly, but something tightened in his chest. Later, while reviewing security footage, Harlan noticed Zora speaking to the twins in a cadence that felt inherited rather than learned. She didn't repeat phrases. She mirrored emotion. When Noel hesitated, Zora waited. When Silas grew restless, she grounded him with stillness. This wasn't training. It was familiarity. Harlan told himself it didn't matter. The results mattered. His children slept. The house felt lighter. That should have been enough. Yet the question kept returning, quiet and persistent. Who was Zora before she arrived here? That evening, Harlan asked the twins about her. She knows Mommy's words, Noel said simply. Silas nodded. She says them the same way. Harlan forced a smile and changed the subject, but the truth settled deeper than fear. His wife had trusted someone enough to teach them her prayers. Someone who stood in this house long before grief made it unrecognizable. Harlan stared at the walls, wondering how many parts of his life had been carried forward without him noticing. The house had kept its secrets well. But secrets grow restless when remembered. He felt them stirring now, closer than ever. It was Noel who finally said it out loud. They were seated at the breakfast table, sunlight spilling across the wood, the kind of ordinary moment Harlan used to rush through. Noel traced circles and spilled syrup while Silas swung his legs, unusually calm. Zora knows where Mommy used to sit, Noel said. Harlan looked up sharply. What do you mean? She knows, Noel repeated. She stands there sometimes. Like she's listening. Silas leaned forward. Mommy talked to her before. A long time ago. The room went very still. Harlan felt his pulse in his throat. You don't remember that, he said too quickly. Yes, we do, Silas replied. Mommy said Zora helped her when she was tired. Noel nodded. She prayed with her. In the kitchen. Before bed. Harlan pushed back his chair and stood, the movement abrupt. The twins watched him carefully as if afraid they'd said too much. He forced his voice to steady. When was this? Before everything, Noel said. Before Mommy got sick. Harlan left the table without another word. He moved through the house like a man underwater, breath shallow, thoughts colliding. He knew what waited upstairs. A room he'd sealed. A truth he'd avoided. The twins' voices followed him, softer now but certain. Zora makes the house feel like Mommy's still here. Harlan stopped at the staircase, hand trembling on the rail. He understood then. The sleeping. The prayers. The peace. This wasn't coincidence. It was return. And he was running out of places to hide. The door resisted him at first. Harlan hadn't opened the room since the week after the funeral. He told staff it was storage. Told himself it was temporary. The lock clicked loudly in the quiet hallway, the sound sharper than it should have been. Inside, the air felt preserved. Boxes lined the walls, neatly labeled in his wife's handwriting. Books stacked beside a chair she used to read in every afternoon. A scarf draped over the back, still carrying her faint perfume. Harlan closed his eyes, steadying himself. On the desk sat a leather-bound notebook. He recognized it immediately. Her prayer journal. Harlan flipped through the pages slowly, hands unsteady. Scripture written in the margins. Notes about the twins, about fear, about trust. And then halfway through, a name appeared more than once. Zora. Not formal. Familiar. She reminds me to breathe. She listens when the nights get heavy. She prays like she believes God hears women too. Harlan sank into the chair, the weight unbearable. Zora hadn't learned those prayers from memory alone. She'd learned them here, in this room, with his wife. During nights Harlan spent working late, believing providing was the same as presence. At the back of the journal was a folded note. If something happens to me, his wife had written, please don't shut God out of this house. And don't forget the people who helped me survive. Harlan pressed the paper to his chest. He had forgotten both. Harlan found Zora in the garden just before dusk. She stood near the old oak tree, hands folded, watching the twins chase each other through fallen leaves. When she saw him, her shoulders tensed slightly. She knew. The truth had a way of arriving before words did. I opened the room, Harlan said. Zora nodded. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She waited. You knew my wife, he continued. Saying it aloud hurt less than he expected. You helped her pray. You helped her when I wasn't here. Yes, Zora said softly. She asked me not to disappear when things got hard. Harlan swallowed. Why didn't you tell me? Because it wasn't mine to lead with, Zora replied. Grief doesn't need information. It needs time. The twins ran past them laughing. Harlan watched them, then turned back to Zora. You came back. Zora's eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. I came because the children were calling out in a language I recognized. Silence settled between them, not empty this time. Sure. Harlan felt the final wall give way. I tried to protect them by controlling everything, he said. I forgot love isn't controlled. Zora nodded. Your wife used to say God lives in the gaps we're afraid to leave open. Harlan looked toward the house, then back at Zora. Will you stay? She didn't answer immediately. The question carried weight. History. Healing. I'll stay, she said at last. As long as truth is welcome here. The oak leaves rustled. The twins slowed, watching their father with cautious hope. For the first time, Harlan didn't look away. He stepped into the moment, unsure, unguarded. And the house breathed with him. The change didn't come all at once. Harlan expected some dramatic release, a moment where grief finally exhausted itself. Instead, it settled into him slowly, like a truth he had to live with rather than conquer. He began noticing the small ways silence had shaped his children. How Silas flinched when rooms emptied too quickly. How Noel filled quiet moments with humming, as if sound itself were protection. Harlan recognized himself in them. He had believed strength meant enduring alone. That love, once lost, should be sealed away to prevent further damage. But he saw now what silence had cost them. Not peace. Not safety. Only distance. One evening, Harlan joined the twins on the floor of the living room. He didn't direct the game or correct the rules. He followed their lead, awkward at first, then lighter. Zora watched from the doorway, careful not to interrupt something fragile and new. Later, Harlan admitted what he'd never said aloud. I was afraid if I let her memory stay, I'd never survive it. Zora nodded. Grief grows when it isn't spoken. That night, Harlan didn't turn off the hallway lights. He left a lamp glowing near the stairs. He let the house make noise. When the twins stirred, he went to them. Not with answers. With presence. For the first time since his wife's death, Harlan didn't try to manage the pain away. He let it exist. And in doing so, he felt something loosen. Silence had once felt like control. Now he understood its cost. And he was finally willing to pay it back with love. Chapter 16. Letting God Back in 260 Words. The prayer came unexpectedly. It was a quiet evening, rain tapping gently against the windows, the twins curled together on the couch. Zora sat nearby, reading, giving the moment room to be ordinary. Harlan stood by the fireplace, listening to the rain, feeling the old discomfort rise. Silas looked up. "Daddy," he said, "can we pray like Mommy used to?" The question landed softly, but it carried weight. Harlan hesitated. He hadn't prayed since the funeral. He'd told himself God understood silence, that faith could wait until grief loosened its grip. But grief had never loosened. It had only deepened. He sat down slowly, heart pounding. "Okay," he said. The word felt fragile. "Honest." Zora didn't lead. She didn't correct. She simply bowed her head. Harlan's voice shook at first. He didn't know the words the way his wife had. So he spoke plainly. He thanked God for rest, for patience, for people who stayed when leaving would have been easier. He asked for help with the nights that still scared him. The twins leaned into him. When he finished, the room felt lighter. Not perfect, just held. Harlan realized faith didn't require certainty. It required willingness. God didn't need him polished or strong, just present. As the twins drifted toward sleep, Harlan stayed with them, breathing evenly. The rain softened. The house rested. And for the first time in a long while, Harlan believed this peace might last. Not because it was controlled, but because it was shared. Chapter 17. A different kind of wealth. 260 words. Harlan returned to work the following week, but something in him had shifted. The meetings felt louder than necessary. The numbers, once comforting, now seemed strangely small. He caught himself leaving early, driving home before sunset, choosing the long road that curved past the hills instead of the direct route. For years, he had measured success in expansion and acquisition. Now he measured it in dinner conversations that didn't end in tears. At home, the twins slept through most nights. When they woke, they called for him, not in panic, but in certainty. Harlan answered every time. He learned their rhythms, their fears, the way Silas needed reassurance spoken aloud while Noelle needed a hand held in silence. Zora remained steady in the background. She didn't take credit. She didn't insert herself into moments that belonged to father and children. That restraint impressed Harlan more than any resume ever had. She understood something he was still learning. Wealth could build walls, but it couldn't teach a house how to rest. One afternoon, Harlan stood in the doorway and watched his children laugh freely, unburdened by the vigilance that once ruled their nights. The house no longer felt like a monument to loss. It felt lived in again. Harlan realized then that the greatest return on investment he would ever see wasn't financial. It was the quiet trust in his children's eyes. The way they believed he would show up. That belief humbled him. He had spent years protecting what he owned. Now he was learning how to care for what he'd been given. And that, he understood, was a different kind of wealth altogether. Chapter 18. The night the house finally slept. 280 words. The night came softly. No build-up. No tension in the air. Just a normal evening, the kind Harlan once rushed past without noticing. The twins brushed their teeth, argued gently over which pajamas felt better, and climbed into bed without fear. Harlan sat with them, the lamp low, the house breathing around them. Zora lingered in the doorway, ready to leave the moment belonged to them. Harlan nodded his thanks. She smiled and stepped away. Silas yawned. Noelle curled toward her brother. "Daddy," Noelle whispered, "the house feels okay now." Harlan swallowed. "I think it does too." He kissed their foreheads and stayed until their breathing slowed. When he turned off the light, the dark no longer felt heavy. It felt complete. Downstairs, Harlan paused by the staircase where he had once frozen in disbelief. The memory returned, but it no longer hurt the same way. It felt like a marker. a before and after. He sat in the living room, alone but not lonely, listening to the steady quiet of a house finally at rest. No cameras, no monitoring screens, just trust. Upstairs, the twins slept through the night. So did Harlan. Morning arrived gently, sunlight spilling across the floors. The house woke without urgency. Grief hadn't vanished, but it no longer ruled. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive with noise or certainty. Sometimes it comes quietly, through listening, through faith spoken softly, through love allowed back in. And when it does, even the most restless house can finally sleep. If this story touched you, take a moment to sit with it. Sometimes the hardest nights aren't loud, they're quiet and heavy and full of things we never said. If you've ever carried grief in silence or watched someone you love struggle while you felt powerless, you're not alone. Stories like this remind us that healing doesn't always come fast, but it does come when we let others in. If this resonated with you, gently tap the like button. Subscribe for more stories that explore faith, loss, and quiet moments that change everything. And if you feel comfortable, share in the comments. What helped your house find rest again? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear tonight.